Before we start today's roundtable, I want to give special thanks to Checkster, our group sponsor. Checkster has become well known in the recruiting industry by providing a platform that easily captures reference checks in the hiring process. I myself have been a customer of theirs for years. I use a reference checking tool for all of my new hires. However, Checkster has now released a new product suite called Insights. This new product suite is really what has excited me to have Checkster as the group sponsor. With Insights, the Checkster platform now covers employees from cradle to grave and not just reference checking, starting when they apply, going to offer, through onboarding, then covering their work at your company, and then to the end with exit interviews. It's an easy to use, easy to understand way of giving and getting feedback from your peers. Checkster's simple goal, to build more productive and passionate teams. Now, if this concept of getting insights from your peers regarding your work sounds familiar, it should, because that's the simple goal of this group. Connecting, communicating, collaborating. Support me, support the group. Follow the link below, recruiting.org/Checkster. This will take you to a landing page to sign up for a quick demo. If you are just thinking about automating your reference checking process, it'll be well worth your time. But I encourage you to check out the full Insights suite. I'd love to find out if you feel the way I feel about it. Now let's get to today's roundtable. All right, let's jump right into it. Thank you everybody for attending episode 68 in Let's Talk Recruiting, where peer practitioners in the TA industry all get together to talk about various topics in our industry that we all come across. Today, we're going to be covering, the topic is tips to use to avoid making bad hires. With that said, let's get right into it. Again, tips to use to avoid making bad hires. Today, we have with us Erica Clicks out of LA, Kara Schaefer out of LA, Glenn Podusky out of New York City, and Matt Liptick out of Boston. And I, of course, am also out of Los Angeles. That's sort of a good LA presence today for some reason. So with that said, Erica, I am going to jump over to you, have you start off the conversation if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I'm Erica. Today I work at Zapier as a recruiting manager. Zapier is a 100% remote software as a service company in the automation space. So we are hiring. We're rapidly hiring. We are hiring across the board, from engineering to support to product to design, and our ops team too. We have gone through like a pretty extensive, I think, process of building out what our hiring process looks like, how we can increase speed. One of the biggest things we definitely focus on is making the right hire. And so a lot of that for us starts at the very beginning of the process. We try to get really clear on who we're looking for. What is this position? Like, what is this position? How do we define this position? What are the expectations of this position at the very beginning when they start at 30, 60, 90 days? And then again at like 2 years, because we're not hiring people for today, we're hiring people for grow. So that's really what we focus on. We do that with scorecards. We talk to team members. We set up our interview panels at the very beginning and plan out what qualities we actually want to address at each interview stage. We are huge users of Greenhouse and the scorecard system. So we use all of the features of the scorecard system. So we recommend the criteria on the Greenhouse scorecards in terms of which criteria we want interviewers to actually evaluate for, because we've gotten plenty of scorecards that just left the thing blank, gave them a thumbs up, which is not exactly helpful in making sure that we're actually addressing the needs of the role. And it's not just about skills for us. Yes, we want somebody who is a content writer and they have to have experience writing certain kinds of content or doing X, Y, Z. But also, are they going to be able to thrive within our environment? And so for us, the biggest thing for us is communication. Are they comfortable with written communication and verbal communication? Are they comfortable with like sharing details? Are they able to really be succinct about what it is they need, how they communicate? We're a globally remote company. So how do they communicate with not knowing if they'll be able to talk to their team member for 12 hours from now? Like, how are we able to make sure that we can continue moving forward? Those are things that we think about when we build out the scorecards at the very beginning of our hiring process. There's a lot into that, but I can leave it there for now.
Erica, can you kind of elaborate in kind of a literal way what your scorecards are and how those work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, at the very beginning of the process, will sit down with the hiring manager and say, okay, what are the skills that we need for the role? Do they need 5 years of experience doing X? Do they need management experience? Do they need to have managed a certain size team or grown a certain size team? And why is that necessary for this particular role? So once we're able to define that, the recruiter will actually sit with the hiring manager and pick out those specific lines and saying, on the scorecard, candidates do they have XYZ? And our scorecards in Greenhouse have a thumbs up, a thumbs down, as well as a strong yes and a strong no. Strong yes and strong no are reserved for really special cases. But most of our scorecards come in with a yes or no. Do they have that thing on the scorecard? And a candidate doesn't necessarily have to check every single criteria, but there needs to be a strong showing, like 90% or more, that the candidate is actually able to fit that criteria and will be able to do the job. Honestly, that's what, like, are they able to do this thing? Will they be able to do the job? So management experience is a really easy one. Do they have experience hiring, building a team? Do they have experience firing? Do they have experience with difficult conversations? Do they have experience keeping their team accountable? When we build the interview process out, we say, okay, we need to know that they have accountability or that they can keep their team accountable to goals. Let's ask questions that are really specific and focused on their past experience doing that thing. So then the question to answer that on the scorecard becomes, tell us about a time that you created goals for your team, and then how, what did that look like? What was that process like? And how did you keep them accountable to it? And that way it gives the opportunity to the candidate to directly address the bullet on the scorecard. So there should be a question for every single bullet at some point in the interview process to be able to say, do they do this thing? Oftentimes there's more than one question. We want to dig into those things more. But at least we have a really specific criteria of, do they pass this interview or not?
So it's almost like a guide for the hiring team in a way, is it?
Definitely. We use our scorecards to guide every hire that we make. We try very hard not to necessarily compare candidate to candidate and say this candidate is better than that one. We root our decisions within the scorecard itself.
Do you ever get to the point where you are comparing candidate to candidate?
Yeah, definitely. There's because we have times where we have awesome, great candidates. We stack candidates who have thumbs up all the way to the end of the process. That's a super fortunate place for us to be. Honestly, it doesn't happen that often, right? All the stars have to align, timing has to be right. We have to get to like the right compensation, all of these things. So it doesn't happen that often that we get somebody who's thumbs up all the way. But when we do have that opportunity, that's really where we dig in. We talk through candidates and we figure out, okay, who is the stronger fit for us for now and for 1 to 2 years from now.
Got it. I'm kind of stating the obvious, and that just kind of goes along with the candidate from the moment that the recruiter's speaking with them all through the hiring process, right? In Greenhouse?
Yeah, absolutely. We follow the process right through from beginning to end in Greenhouse, and all those scorecards are in Greenhouse, and every time, like at every stage. We do not have our interviewers look at previous their interviews focused on the criteria that they are supposed to be evaluating for. But the recruiter and the hiring manager are able to review all of the scorecards and take a look and to try to make a like an objective decision about, is this candidate stronger than this one?
I'm a big fan of the collaborative content when interviewing candidates. I don't know if it's always technically feasible rather than just passing email strings along between the hiring team, depending upon what system you use. But for all the panelists, have you used these types of scorecards like Erica's speaking to before?
I've actually used something in the past called top grading. We used to do top grading at a company I was at one point, and the top grading was scorecards as well. 2 people on the interview teams would go into the interview at a time, and they would concentrate on certain competencies that they were assigned. Then there was a scorecard and an actual score that they were given to that candidate at the end of the interview process. And it was a grueling interview process for any type of candidate. It was usually reserved for directors and above. But that top grading, and there's an actual book by, I think his name was Brad Smart, who wrote the book on top grading. Actually, we had to get certified or learn top grading, and that was similar with that type of format with the scorecard and so forth. But that was one point where I used that type of interview scenario.
And we use more of an informal process managed through Excel, where we'll assign competencies. We'll assign ratings and rankings. And then at least we're using a consistent process as we're interviewing the candidates, and then rating and ranking them all in that same criteria. But no fancy system, literally managed through Excel.
So BuzzFeed uses Greenhouse as well. So you're speaking my language, Erica. Yeah, scorecards and Greenhouse have such a great ability to be adjusted per role. So for example, I'm working on a few freelance editor and producer roles right now, and we've been able to edit specific questions to ensure all of the members of the hiring panel are asking the same questions to our candidates to ensure a fair interview process, that each candidate is asking those or answering those same questions, so we can make a strong decision based on how they answer those questions. And we do also, as Erica mentioned, stick with those behavioral type questions. So really, can these candidates answer how they solved an issue or a challenge that might be similar to a challenge they may face at BuzzFeed as well? So yeah, scorecards are key to making great hiring decisions.
And what I love about scorecards or anything similar to it is just the sharing of it versus everybody's kind of interviewing on their own, which is, I think that's the majority of companies, because they do it that way because just out of circumstance. And the recruiters help where they can, but they're not in every single interview and things like that, helping the hiring team is there. I've seen companies where they offer hiring manager interview training, but managers typically don't take it unless they have a immediate opening for a rec, and they may not have time to take it in time before the interview, blah, blah, blah. There's a question in there about in the chat area about templates. And this sort of goes back to the world. If you do have a tool like Greenhouse, are you creating a library for job roles, or if you're kind of creating it ad hoc on your own? Like I've seen before, we had interview guides in Word that we would share with the hiring manager who's recruiting for a certain role, and it would have that library. Here's where you should really focus on for this role. Are we creating them, this type of measuring? Are we doing it ad hoc with the rec, or do we kind of have like a strategy that we're going forward that's pre-planned?
So for our team, we have, it's a little bit of a hybrid. Our core values are on every single scorecard. And so that's something we hire really strongly against, with our core values in mind. And then we have like basically a bank and saying, okay, so if we're looking for this skill that is in engineering, it's also very similar to the skill that we also look for in product or in support. So we can, utilize the same qualities or the same scorecard like attributes across different roles, but we also then refine them for each individual role, because the qualities that we're looking for a content writer are very different than the qualities that we might be looking for our technical support team. And we want to make sure that we're looking for the qualities that suit the job and not trying to go beyond the expectations of what the role are just to fit like a general framework for us at Zapier. We want to be really clear about like our expectations and what we're trying to hire for, and then creating scorecards to match those expectations.
Anybody else to add to that?
We take a very similar approach. I think the standard being we assess everyone on our leadership criteria, our leadership profile, and then it's a little bit more ad hoc. Should it be more of a technology role or investment role or an accounting role? And then we add in more of those technical skills or capabilities.
Have you ever seen where this type of scorecarding in the interview process, once let's say they get hired, now they move into your HRS, does that go with them, or is it kind of, it's just gated at the ATS and that's where it stays?
For us, that's a That's a 2021 project, actually, is taking a look at the data from our scorecards and then our 30-day check-in and our 90-day check-in, and then taking a look at like, oh, like, did this person actually perform the way we expected them to based on how we interviewed them? So that we can then go back and say like, did this criteria matter? Does this scorecard align with the role itself, which will help us then kind of iterate on our whole process. And the hope is that we can really take a lens to this process and say, like, does this make sense? Does this type of interview, does this type of style actually make sense for us? So we're really excited about that, but we're not there yet.
Got it.
What's interesting is if you make a mishire for some reason in the hiring process and you can revert back to the scorecard or the interview feedback for purposes, it's interesting to gauge where that mishire may have occurred during the interview process. And we've seen that several times. We've reverted back to the feedback, back to the competencies. Maybe we misaligned somewhere along the way in the interview process. But it's very interesting to revert back to, what Erica's saying on the scorecard piece, looking at the criteria and seeing if maybe we matched it up the right way, or maybe we had to redo it, or, learning from that mishire.
I always think if that feedback during the interview process lives in the email, it's probably going to be lost forever. I don't think we're going to go dig it out, right? It has to live somewhere.
I agree.
Excellent. Thank you, Erica. Did you want to add anything else to that?
No, I mean, there's lots of things to add, but we're good.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, again, just because I love that. Like, I did quite a few years consulting and go in and kind of develop programs. And what I found when speaking to people, if you can literally have something to visually point to, whether it's the screen or a piece of something printed, the difference between me and you having a conversation versus us talking to something, people's thoughts and imaginations just comes out if they can speak to an object, right? So just having that scorecard or a packet of any sort around a candidate just adds to the conversation, I think. And you can walk into a room in a hiring team of developers, and you're not a developer, and kind of have an easier conversation. It's not easy, but it's easier. All right, Kara, let's jump over to you and to your item.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Kara Schaefer. I'm a senior recruiter at BuzzFeed, and I also manage our freelance hiring process. And the kind of focus I wanted to go over today is really that, and I saw a lot of comments in the chat here, which is great, the importance of debriefing with your hiring panel. So making sure that you, as the recruiter, you're working with the hiring managers and the panel, or the interview loop in the process. I also happen to lead our interview training, so we do ensure that all members of interview loops have that training prior to going into an interview. Very important for sure. So the big thing for me is making sure when I have that intake meeting with the hiring manager, I'm making it clear that that debrief is important, that we need to have all members who are interviewing candidates involved in, even if it's a 30-minute debrief, once everyone's interviewed the candidates, to really go through, what are your thoughts? What were the pros? What were the cons? How can these candidates impact them in their day-to-day and their role? To ensure that we're making a good hire that's a collaborative hire, someone that can work with all members of the interview panel. So we usually set those up. We go, a few weeks in, we'll decide when it makes sense to schedule that debrief, just to make sure it's on everyone's calendars before it gets too late and we're all booked. And yeah, we take the time. I sit in on those every time to really kind of moderate that discussion, bring up some points that maybe we're missing, to really ensure that, we want to make inclusive hires. We want to make hires that are going to benefit the teams that we have and the things that we're missing. There may be some skills that we just don't have, and it's necessary to have someone bring those skills to the table. So really ensuring everyone's heard. I'm a big supporter of making sure if I see someone who hasn't spoken up yet, I want to check in with them. I want to make sure every voice is heard in that panel. So yeah, we do those for just about all of our roles, every role that I support. I'm a huge fan of doing those debriefs. And here's another question. So we do wait until all candidates interview. It's the best way to ensure that we are not showing any kind of unconscious bias through the process. you may show there are various forms of unconscious bias, and you may show that in the way of maybe this person went to your same school, maybe this person is your high level energy. So we do want to make sure that we are interviewing every candidate and then doing the debrief. And it takes some time, but it's so important. It's so important to make sure everyone's heard in the panel.
So, Kara, just kind of a literal question around that, waiting till you interviewed all the candidates. What if it's like one of those hard to find positions? And I mean, if you can put a slate of candidates together, I always prefer that. But what if it's saying like, hey, when I find the one, I'm going to get them into the cycle because they're not easy to find. Is it possible to wait in those types of situations where it's like you're finding your unicorn, for lack of better words?
So in some cases, what we'll do is we'll do a first round. So we'll interview, our top 3 to 5 people from our sourcing efforts. And if we find our rock star, if we find our magical unicorn, as you will, sure, it makes sense to move forward if everyone agrees that hire is the best hire for that team. And if not, if we really truly feel like that was not, those candidates didn't fit, the criteria we were looking for, then we'll do a second round of interviews in person or virtual during COVID. So yeah, I think the risk, of course, is if you find that rock star, you do not want to lose them to another competitor or another company. So if they kill it in the debrief, if everyone agrees that that specific candidate could be a great fit for the team, yes, we'll definitely move forward. But if there's any delay, if there's any concern that the candidates that were in that first round couldn't do it, we will definitely do another round. And we'd prefer to take that risk to ensure that we are making the right hire and not just taking someone because maybe they could be a great fit. We want the right fit.
Got it. So I got another little question around debriefs because I do think they are an important piece of the cycle. Let's say you have the end of slate, or you're at that perfect, everybody's coming interviewed. Are you collecting that feedback in a debrief in kind of an anecdotal way, or is it kind of like, hey, you got your scorecards, make sure you complete your feedback on your scorecards and you're reviewing scorecard information?
Yep. So we do deadlines on scorecards. So we make sure everyone's completed their scorecards before we have the debrief. So that's really where we hold our data, is those scorecards. I'm usually the note taker in those debriefs as well, just to make sure we do have that information that's shared and notes that are shared. And then I'll usually keep that, in my files just to have on my end. But the scorecards are our true way to tell, how everyone felt after interviewing, and to be able to bring those all up in the debrief, have them all up on screen to call out what are those key things we were looking for, and how does this candidate or these candidates fall into that.
To the other panels too, how are you conducting? I'm going to assume basically everybody does a formalized debrief or an informal debrief. Is that safe to say? And how are you conducting your debriefs?
I'd say that's safe to say. We don't have necessarily a lot of structure around it. I would say it's a little bit run by recruiter in business unit. We do have debrief forums. Some groups will hold debrief sessions after the interviews are completed and get everyone on the call and kind of hash out at that particular time. There's other times where my recruiters are just gathering each individual debrief. They're compiling it and then they're circling back with the hiring team. So it's not a one size fits all for how we manage it.
Yeah, I think that's similar to Glenn. I think we do the same thing here. It's the recruiters on my team will go in and conduct the debrief, roundtable discussion, making sure the feedback is shared collectively from all the hiring managers at that roundtable, so everyone hears the various opinions on the candidate. But I've also seen it the other way, where they want to get, we want to get private feedback from each hiring manager or each individual on the panel to make sure that we're cross-referencing it and making sure that people aren't clouding anyone's judgment on the candidate choice.
That's also what we do. We actually don't do a formal debrief in most circumstances. When we have a really when scorecards are all over the place, we definitely do, because we want to dig into where our expectations misaligned. But for the most part, we really revert to the scorecards and we say, if this candidate is meeting XYZ across the board at every interview stage, we've got thumbs up across the board. We default, I'll always sync, and our team will always sync with the hiring managers, who will do a final review, particularly at the reference stage, to like dig in on any points or patterns we might see, anything we might see along the way. But it's really the hiring manager's call on if we're just going to move forward. They'll often talk to their team, and I'll come in, or our recruiters will come into those conversations, but it's not necessarily a formal part of our process.
Interesting. So question around information that a recruiter can attain that's not created in an interview. So for example, let's say you have a coworker or was an employee referral of a candidate, and you have their feedback. They're not necessarily, let's say they're not on the hiring team, but they have that type of feedback for them. Or you have references from this individual. Are we packing that together for the debrief meetings or the final round of what your hiring process for Erica, if you don't have a formal debrief meeting, anything like that? Are we getting that external information in there at this point? And then like another example would be if it's a developer position and they do a skill coding test, or it's all the way to an administrative coordinator who took an Excel test. Is that part of this packet that we're looking at these final slate of candidates, that type of information?
We personally do referrals and reference checks and things like that after the debrief. That's before actually putting together the offer. So we like to hear the team's feedback and really gather that first. And then we go into, the actual reference check, which we typically do 3 or so per candidate. But yeah, that's personally how we do the process.
For us, when it comes to referrals and feedback outside of the actual interview process, we try to actually keep that information compartmentalized, because we're really trying to focus on the information of the interview as for each individual hiring interviewer to have an unbiased, or as unbiased as we can personally all be, unbiased opinion or unbiased view of the candidate based on the performance in the interview. So that is information that we might take and we might share either with hiring managers, or we might share like outside of the kind of experience of the interviewers themselves. And then references for us, the hiring manager will see the references, but the rest of the interview team won't necessarily see the references. We keep that we also use anonymous reference. We use an anonymous survey tool to collect references so that those can be as candid as our references actually want them to be, as a way to help really kind of take bias out of the process.
Yeah, and I think that I've just similar with the reference checking piece. And, I'm a big fan of automated reference checking. I've used them for years. Automated reference checking, anonymous tools, just like Erica was mentioning, taking that in to the hiring manager final, meeting with that hiring manager to check the boxes if that's the candidate of choice. However, these automated reference checking tools suggest that we do bring the reference checks in on the third stage interview or that final interview, or at that debrief stage, or those pre-offer stages. So very tough decision to be able to do that. We have tried that. It just doesn't, candidates are reluctant to give references at that stage, but they suggest these automated reference tools to bring those references into that final stage interview. And it's an interesting, change to the way people are interviewing today.
Glenn, anything to add on that piece?
Yeah, this is kind of in line too with what I was going to speak about. I look for my team to be assessing and probing and doing research on a candidate throughout the process. I'm a big fan, and maybe just, working in New York City my entire career, or Metro New York, having a lot of contacts of kind of informal references. I do not a fan of, give me 2 references and I check them and they tell me how great you are. So doing a lot of back checking, but in terms of really empowering my team to be able to poke and prod and assess the candidate from the minute the resume comes in to the minute the day before they join. And part of that is, my team's all tied to the industry. Most of them have worked in other shops. So making sure that they're doing their due diligence. Now, with that being said, I think there's a knack to that, and it's not just calling up your friend over there and be like, oh, that person's not good, and what's the source and how are they related, and is it objective and what have you. But yeah, I'm a big fan of that, and it's because, and again, maybe being in New York, and it's a slogan on the subways, right? If you see something, say something. So the more that we're gathering information and those experiences throughout the process, to me, is really critical to us assessing. So again, not super formal, but we're bringing it to management at different stages. And then if we're hearing something in terms of, oh, did you know that this person left their firm? And it's okay, well, we're in second round interviews. Let's poke and prod that a little bit more to understand, because that might be different of what we thought when the candidate originally came to us.
Yeah, I'm with you. Personal references, I disregard them. It really is, to me, about who did you work primarily for, right, at the previous company with. Okay, but I'm really looking for who you worked for at your previous company. So I think this is just this point of reference checking and who you get it from is kind of an interesting one in the industry to me. And so full disclosure, I came from agency. I worked at desk as an agency. When I moved into corporate, it was more of supporting sourcers to work like an agency at companies. So my actual working the desk was all agency, then I come and support corporate. We always did, we did reference checking to managers before we even submitted the resume or the candidate to it, because basically the approach was, this candidate has our name on it when we give it to a manager. When I moved into the corporate world, I've yet to meet anybody who did it early in the stage. When they do it, it's at the end. It seems to be more of a formality, but I'm one of those where I totally get the interview process and behavioral interview and everything like that. But boy, I sure like to hear what they did in the past versus how well they answered questions in the interview process. I put them together, you got a nice packet. So I literally used to run the rec to an old manager. Here's what I'm looking at him doing. Where's weaks and strengths, pros and cons, stuff like that. So I think it comes down to time from a recruiter's perspective, but then at that level and that depth of how you want to go outside of that interviewing process. And any thoughts around, well, what are everybody's thoughts around the timing? If you could do it earlier, would you? Or is it just get it at the end? What's the thoughts around that? Because I'm a big believer, past can predict the future. That's why I kind of harp on finding out about their past from other people other than the candidate themselves.
Yeah, I don't think there's any harm in doing it earlier. To take it a step further, I'll tell you a telltale sign is, and I think about a similar case with one of my executive recruiters. And just recently, she was hiring a senior compliance officer. And this was at the final stage where she had asked, okay, I need some professional references. And the telltale sign was when he was like, I don't know, my manager, they changed. Where, if you ask me the same question, I'll give you, my last 5, not that I've worked in that many firms. I've been at this company 5 years and one before that 10. But I'll give you the company I started my career in, and I'll give you his email, cell phone number, and, direct line into him. So I also thought that was telltale that here's a senior executive, and within the last 5 years, he couldn't remember or was having trouble tracking down who his manager, who he wasn't working for anymore, was. So I was like, okay, well, listen, fair enough, I think. But I also look at that as is that a warning shot fired over the bow?
It's interesting. So we request 2 current or former managers, and then 2 of any other type of reference. And there are times when we aren't able to get to, sometimes their earlier stage career, they don't have 2 managers, or they only have a current manager, and we can forgive those things. I think the signs for us are when they maybe dodge that question around hiring manager, as opposed to saying, even if you're transparent and say I didn't have a good relationship with my former manager, or that's better for us than what you're talking about in terms of I can't find them, I don't know, that's we're living in 2020, you can find anybody on the internet. And so there are definitely signs along the way, But in general, our references, I think Matt mentioned in the chat, we've caught plenty of flags in these anonymous references, because you can't prove who said who. Like, we can't actually look at the data unless we have a certain number of responses. And so it's a really great way of talking about people's strengths and people's weaknesses. And when there's a big difference in the scores, we can, in skill survey at least, there's a really good way for us to see, like, oh, there's a 7-point scale and somebody rated this person a 3 or a 4 on this quality. Like why? So maybe we don't pass on them right away, but it's certainly like more information for us to dig into and say, is this really important for this particular role? Is this person aware that the reference they provided might not necessarily actually support, want to work with them again? And we kind of dig into that. So it's just more information for us. We do not live or die by the references, but it gives us more context to be able to make a decision on.
Got it. Excellent. Kara, that started off as your item. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I appreciate what Glenn said about also just earlier on, doing your due process to understand from others. I had a situation in my last job where we brought someone in for an interview, and a team member that was not on the interview panel recognized the candidate coming in and pulled me aside afterwards to let me know that she had a terrible experience working with that person at her last job where they worked together. And as I spoke to her further, we also found out that the candidate had the wrong title on her resume and made herself look like she brought this experience that she really didn't have. And she was an excellent interviewer, let me tell you, or interviewee. So, it kind of took just talking to others on the team that work on the team that weren't on the panel to know, what is that person's actual background. And that helped us, prevent making a bad hire of someone that probably didn't have the right experience to help us in that role.
Interesting. I was going to go down a little rabbit hole with that, but I'm not going to. But yes, it's funny, the coincidence that they happen to see him and stuff like that. I also have a story like that where they saw him coming in through the hallways, and is that person interviewing here? It kind of goes along the story that you just told. All right, thank you very much, Carol. Glenn, let's jump over to you into your item.
Sure, no, thanks. So Glenn Podusky, I oversee recruiting. I'm with New York Life in New York City. I oversee recruiting for our investment management business. And as an investment manager, we're north of 600 billion under management, and all of our corporate functions. We've been around for 175 years, very strong culture, a lot of long tenured employees, very consensus driven, very collaborative type organization, and with a long tenured employee base, relationships are really key to success. So there's a few things, and I kind of was just touching on it earlier. It's really empowering the recruiters that throughout the process, from start to finish, that they're probing and prodding. And if they see something, they say something, and they're highlighting their concerns. And, because there's a lot of times that there's warning shots that are fired, and it's, sometimes it's a hard recruit and they took them a while to build this candidate pool. And it's almost like, well, okay, they look the other way. And I think 9 times out of 10, if you see something, it's because something's going to come up. Or is that a telltale sign of maybe the person's behaviors, right? I think the other thing that's important, and my head of technology does it, so I kind of started doing it as well because I think it makes a lot of sense, is so before COVID, very much an on-site organization, in-person meetings, interviews on-site. So my recruiting coordinators will escort candidates throughout the building and take them to the interviews. Well, when the interviews are all done, the head of technology would call my coordinator and say, what did you think of that candidate? And a lot of times, and our coordinators are literally fresh out of college or, a year or two experience. And they're like, but part of it, he was doing it in terms of saying, how was your interaction with that individual? How did that individual treat you? And there are times where my coordinator said the person was a jerk, or the person was rude, or the person, and he said, I appreciate it. And he used that in terms of feedback. So I actually do that now, again, when we were on site, and I would say, help me understand, what did you think of the candidate? And there are times that they'll say something, and I'm like, you know what, I saw the same thing. Let's dig into that more. I also, and we're not a huge metric shop. We don't do time to fill or any of that type of stuff. So I only, tell my recruiters, like, there's been times like we are at the altar ready to make an offer and it's like something comes up. We're better off blowing it up now versus finding out that we were right. And the other thing I'll tell the recruiters, and from my experience, I've highlighted a lot of concerns about candidates. A lot of those concerns were overlooked and the person started. Throughout my career, I've never had someone come back to me and say, you know what, you got that one wrong. The person's actually a top performer. If they come in and I was wrong and they're a good performer, I think it's forgotten. There's plenty of times that it's come back where the manager will call me and say, you know what, you were right. I should have looked into this a little bit more. So it's all about like, let's, put your concerns out there, because the recruiters have better line of sight into a manager that might have interviewed this person for 45 minutes or an hour. The other piece of it to add on to that is like EQ and the soft skills are so important to success. People at New York Life do not fail because they lack the technical skills. They fail because of the EQ. Hardest thing, and we spoke about, debrief and behavior-based interview, like it's hard to assess. So these interactions that we're having with individuals show the person's behaviors, and it really helps in terms of, highlighting whether somebody may or may not be successful at the firm.
And around the EQ characteristics of people, right? And where they fit in or what have you. From a recruiting perspective, it kind of circles back to post-hire information, right? From a recruiter's perspective, whether you said it or not, whether you felt it, I'm not quite sure, but we'll keep an eye on it. As a recruiter, are we ever following up post-hire to see how people are fitting in, say in those first 30 days or 60 days, or is that more of an HR function? Or as a recruiter, when you had a feeling about somebody or a concern, are we following up or are we kind of leaving it to somebody in HR or the business?
Yeah, I mean, I would tell you from my experience at New York Life, I only handle the executive hires, but there's been executives that we've hired where I've said, it's not going to work. In fairness, I think of one particular case, and the guy was phenomenal, like industry expert, but in terms of EQ, he was a disaster. He didn't make it three months. So within a month and a half, I didn't even have to follow up because I started hearing about, some of the rumblings, and I'm like, I told you, right? And I think that's the flip side of it is I don't like saying I told you, but there's been too many times where I said, I told you. But Sean, I guess to that point, I do think that's a best practice in terms of that following up and understanding, especially to help recruiters, calibrate on what they were thinking and the success profile and is it aligned. In fairness, we don't do a great job with it. And it's more so that we hear about it through our HR partners in different meetings, like, oh, this person came in and they're struggling. The only other thing about it is we're a very employee-friendly organization, and we're all about spend the first 90 days to figure out where the coffee machine is. So the expectations for the first 90 days are you're going to figure out your email address and where the coffee machine is versus any true deliverable. So sometimes really success for us, you're not going to know unless they're a disaster about a year down the line.
But to the rest of the panelists, how about that around following up a little bit post-hire? Is that on your radar, or is it the baton been passed, so to speak?
I mean, I encourage all my recruiters on my team to follow up on a 30, 60, 90-day check-in to just ensure that person's feeling welcome. And, even on the onboarding piece, just making sure that they have everything they need, that they're feeling comfort level in the organization. And then they can kind of back off a bit. But, as a recruiter, when I recruited positions, I still would go around the organization. I'd see people I hired, I'd check in with them. And it's just a regular piece of in my process that I do. So.
We do too. We actually have we have a more formal process for it. We have surveys from hiring managers and from candidates on how the 30, 60, 90 days are going. But then we always just recommend to keep that relationship going because you're the face that brought them into the company. But I will say, when we decide to make a hire, we're not holding the baggage of their interview with them. We've committed to this person. We're bringing them on board. We're going to give them the shot. We're going to give them the chance. We definitely do review if things don't work out, and we do go back into the scorecards like we were talking about before to take a look at what went wrong, like, was this flag wasn't red enough. Maybe we should next time make sure that we learn from that. But like you get a clean slate when you come in. Like we've decided you're going to come on board and we're going to invest in you just like you're investing in us.
Yep, same here. I am a huge fan of 30 days in. I check in with all of my hires. I also, up until earlier this year, was leading new hire orientation. So I did have that touch point on their first day, was their contact within their first week, getting all their resources. Typically HR kind of takes it over from there in terms of learning and development and, ensuring they have all the resources they need. But I'm a huge fan of keeping that relationship strong, checking in after 30 days. I miss being in the office to be able to say hi and check in with them in person, but, ensuring that I do that virtually within the 30 days and making sure they know they can always come to me with any questions they have.
Carrie, you raise an interesting point. I think with the world being virtual now, and let's say this continues into 2021, and let's say the work from home stays around for years to come, I think these touch points with systems or surveys or questions or the scorecards is going to be more prevalent because, to your point, you can't walk by their office and say, how's it going? Or get that vibe, that feel there. I think Workday, just because they have a recruit and a HRS, is the best chance at connecting the two. I think with other tools like Tableau or Microsoft Power BI, where, hey, dump all your data in here and we'll give you back these cool looking dashboards and these metrics and analysis. It's going to be an interesting way to see how those types of industries take our workplace now going forward, as far as like getting information and collecting it back. To me, it goes back to collecting information, providing that packet or scorecard back to the hiring team, and to see what happens long term. Did we get it right or didn't we? All right. Excellent. Again, thank you very much. I get the impression that you don't like to say I told you so, but do you still say I told you so?
I do.
Yeah. In the past, if I had to push a candidate in thinking they're going to be a really good hire and you're getting pushed back, they ultimately make that hire and they're still around a year later, that's when I send a little present, that person's anniversary date. So it's kind of the reverse of I told you so, but in a good way. All right, Matt, let's jump over to you.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'll make mine pretty quick. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the alignment of the job description and the interview panel and slate, and the candidate pool slate, as the importance of that, finding the right hire. I think that so many times we've seen the job description start out as one thing in the beginning of the interview process and then end up being something else and totally misaligned to maybe what that hiring manager was originally looking for. And, we're starting to use tools like, the gender decoder tools to work on our job descriptions, to concentrate on the diversity piece. We're starting to use tools around, putting that job description through a number of different audiences to make sure that we're aligned with that process, and then setting up our interview panels, making sure that we have the right people on the interview panel to probe on the right questions, the competencies, and assigning the right competencies to those interview panels. I've seen so many times that the direction of the interview process or the recruiting process can go just badly, leading to a very sometimes poor hire because both the job description and the interview panel didn't line up in the correct way. And I think it's very important to get that up front, but then as it changes throughout the interview process, the recruiting teams to pay attention to how that's changing and how the comparison between some of the candidate pool is aligning to that job description and to the interview panel with some of the feedback coming out of it. So I think that's essential. I've seen so many times that changes throughout the process, and I think it's important to align on that. And, we're starting to pay, again, attention to diversity and inclusion. We're starting to pay attention to how these interview panels are set up and also how the candidate pools are put forth. And I think it's important to know, what that looks like in the beginning and stating that up front in some of the intake meetings is going to be important for that.
Matt, from a candidate's perspective, do you think they can figure out in the first 30 days, hey, this isn't what I was told it was?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I've seen candidates come back to me sometimes, especially the technical candidates that, may have thought the job was one thing looking at the description, and it was entirely different type of role, or the responsibilities were different because that job description wasn't aligned in the process. And the interview process may line up with the candidate, but the job description was a mismatch in some way. So, that's something that the mishire from that position is that's terrible.
Yeah, Glenn, to your point, from a hiring perspective, it may take more than 30, 60, 90 days to find out, did you or did you not make the right hire? But just from that candidate's perspective, I think they're quicker to tell, oh, this isn't the right match from my candidate's perspective. That's why I'm a big fan of that 30-day survey, right? How's it going so far? Just to summarize it shortly, just from a recruiter's perspective, okay, we're doing something wrong bringing these candidates in, and they're not going to be here long term. That rec's going to be coming back to my desk. That's one thing from a selfish perspective as a recruiter. I really want to make the good hires so I don't have to fill this rec again in 30 days, 60 or 90 days, just from a selfish perspective versus a company perspective and the whole cost of hire and things like that. I know we're going a little bit late. I appreciate everybody staying on and having a great conversation. I do want to add one last thing that I recommend every recruiter get from their HR department is a terminations report. And it could be less than 1 year term report, just to see, depending upon the size of your company, how big the report is, to see the ones that you recruited into, if they left less than a year, was it voluntary, involuntary, just to kind of give some insight if you don't have any types of BI tools or super systems to be able to do that. But I think there's a lot of telling in that terms report less than a year, because something went wrong if they're here less than a year. I think it's kind of safe to say. On that point, any thoughts around looking at term reports as far as, because we're talking about making bad hires, you don't really know till down the road. Do you guys look at term reports?
Yeah, I look at it all the time to get a sense of, and I almost track it on a monthly basis, and for a couple of reasons. Very heavily into the data, but then see, is there trends? As you mentioned, is the team making bad hires? But then is there also any trends, like are we seeing more people leaving a particular group? And then does that align to anything that we've seen, i.e. poor management, what have you? Because the HR business partners, although they see it as the candidates or the hires, the employees leaving, I've never seen them really pay any attention or do anything with the data. So yeah, matter of fact, I just pulled one for our investment management space this morning as we were sharing it. And in this particular case, looking at it from a diversity lens, as we look at what's the internal makeup, what's our applicant pool, how are we hiring, and then are we losing people at that same percentages?
Yeah, and I think that we, Sean, we go back to the TA dashboard and the analytics piece. We're starting to track those things, the exit interviews, the recruitment funnel, how people are falling off throughout that funnel, but also how they're falling off after 1 year of service, or we're starting to report on those types of statistics. So that's a big piece to look at. It really is.
Yeah, I think that actually contributes to what I was saying, where that's something that's on a horizon to do, is to be able to come back to the end result of a hire. What happened. Right now, we do it on more of a case by case. We have pretty low turnover, so we're able to do it on more of a case by case to take a look back at the feedback, talk to the people that they interacted with most about what didn't work, so that we can be sure to kind of incorporate that into either backfilling the position or in general in our hiring process going forward. The thing we do want to be careful about is this a overall theme that we should be looking for, or is this one particular instance? Because we don't necessarily want to say oh, well, this person had X quality, so we're never hiring anyone who has that ever again, because we're all individuals, we're all different, and we all have different ways that we handle circumstances. So we don't want to generalize. We want to make sure that we're trying to be unbiased in how we're actually analyzing all that feedback.
And I was at one place where if you exited voluntarily less than a year, we'd wait 30 days and go look at your LinkedIn profile to see where you landed, to see if you went to a competitor. And that was mostly just for anecdotal reasons, but that was one of the tasks to see who are we losing them to if we wanted to keep them when they left. And their odds are they're not going to tell you when they're leaving. So you have to wait a little bit. All right. Yeah, we were coming on the hour mark. So any final thoughts or comments? I know it's we all do our best to make sure we got the right hire for all the right reasons, but any final thoughts or comments on avoiding a bad hire?
I think mishires happen, and it is a learning experience. And we, as I mentioned, look back and see what might have occurred in the interview process and also during the person's tenure at the company. But mishire is bound to happen. It's a matter of controlling the mishires in the way that you not only set up the interview, set up the job description, set up the stance from the employer point of view, but also that candidate experience translating over to the onboarding experience into the employee experience. And I think that's a big deal.
No, Matt, are you using the phrase misfire versus bad hire specifically for a reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always called it that. It's more of a mishire, where we missed something, or we just there was a misstep somewhere in the process, and I never would wanted to call them bad hires. I think that I've referred to them more as a mishire. So yeah, similar.
Yeah, I think I'm going to steal that from you. I like that better than bad hires. All right. Anybody else? Any final thoughts?
I'll just add that this is really, even more important in today's, kind of COVID working environment, especially, being a firm that was very much on site, that we're not seeing some of these cues that we would have seen with people on site. So then how do we make sure from a Zoom interaction that we're even doing more of this due diligence, so we're not missing any of this based on not being able to see the person face to face.
Yep. I would hate to see somebody discounting an interview just because they had bad lighting on their Zoom, right? Or something that little, right?
That tends to be me with the windows in the background. They're in the wrong direction.
Erica, Kara, anything?
I think the one just interesting thing that I do as a recruiter is a lot of times when I open a new rec and I'm not familiar with the role itself and the team themselves, I schedule a 30-minute shadow session where I sit with someone in that role and I just watch them do what they do. And it's such a great way for me to fully grasp what the team's, what the team has in terms of skill set, what they're missing, but also just to be able to fully talk to the candidate about what the role is in the day-to-day. I find just that upfront beginning conversation, just to be able to say, hey, these are, this is the software we're using. This is how the team operates. This is how we work collaboratively. For me, that's helpful. It makes me feel strong that I can have that strong conversation with that candidate to ensure they have that background that we're looking for, but also that they could just be a great add to the team, the culture, the environment, the just anything that may be missing to bring a new perspective onto the team. It's just a random thing I do. And I've always done that as a recruiter. There's sometimes you just don't have the time, but it's so helpful if you can.
Excellent. It's a great idea. Talking shop. Erica, a final comment?
Yeah. I'll just say super fast that I know for me, when I think about like our most successful hires, it's always at the very beginning about setting expectations. This is who we are. This is what the role is. This is how we operate, giving as much information and transparency around that as we can. Not every candidate is always going to be a great listener and get it. But the best that we can do on our end is set expectations for the hiring team, set expectations for interviewers, for the candidates themselves. And then they take it from there, basically.
Got it. Excellent. Well, hey, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks again for going over with me. Great conversation. With that said, thank you very much. I'll let everybody go, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.